Welcome to the latest episode of News This Week. We've got all the top stories and developments of the week, so sit back, relax, and get ready for a dose of current events. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more updates and insights.
More than 100 people were killed by a suicide bomb at a mosque in Peshawar, a city in northwest Pakistan. Nearly all the dead were members of the security forces. The mosque was located in a heavily fortified area. The Pakistan Taliban was blamed for the atrocity, though it denied involvement. Last November, the militants called off a peace process with the government and said they would carry out attacks across the country. Critics of the process say it allowed the Taliban to regroup.
Meanwhile, Pakistan's government held another round of talks with the IMF over a possible bailout. Ahead of the negotiations, the government raised fuel prices and loosened foreign exchange controls, which sent the rupee to a new low. Foreign reserves are dwindling, causing a backlog of imports at ports as buyers scramble to find the necessary dollars to pay for goods.
Democracy activists staged a silent strike in Myanmar to mark 2 years since the country's junta seized power. Myanmar has been racked by violence since the coup, a resistance movement having sprung up to fight the army on multiple fronts. This week, the junta extended the country's state of emergency for at least another 6 months.
Chinese health officials said the wave of COVID-19 that has torn through China since December is coming to an end. Last month's Lunar New Year holiday appears not to have led to a new spike in cases. Independent experts said the reported decline in infections made sense, but China is believed to be undercounting COVID deaths.
Antony Blinken, America's Secretary of State, visited Israel and the West Bank in an attempt to reduce tensions following an increase in violence. A Palestinian gunman shot dead 7 people at a synagogue in Jerusalem, the worst incident of its kind in Israel since 2008. The attack came after Israeli forces stormed a Palestinian refugee camp at Jenin, killing 10 people. 2 Palestinians were killed and 2 Israelis were wounded in separate shootings.
A drone attack on a munitions factory in the Iranian city of Isfahan was reportedly carried out by Mossad, Israel's intelligence service, from inside Iran.
Just 11% of the electorate in Tunisia voted in parliamentary runoff elections that were boycotted by the main parties. Critics of Kais Saied, the president, said the low turnout was a rejection of his reforms, which give the presidency near absolute power.
The deaths of 2 journalists heightened concerns about attacks on free speech in Africa. The body of Mani Zogo Arsene Salomon, a radio journalist in Cameroon, was found on the outskirts of the capital 5 days after he was abducted and apparently tortured by unknown people. And human rights groups have demanded a full investigation into the death of John Williams Ntwali, a journalist in Rwanda, after authorities said he was killed in a car crash.
UN experts called for a probe into war crimes in Mali allegedly committed by security forces and Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group. The experts said they had received alarming accounts of horrific executions, mass graves, acts of torture, rape and sexual violence.
America imposed fresh sanctions on Paraguay's former president, Horacio Cartes, and serving vice president, Hugo Velasquez, accusing them of rampant corruption. It alleges that Mr. Cartes, a rich businessman, had used illicitly acquired wealth to expand his political and economic power, and says both men have links with Hezbollah, a militant group backed by Iran. The two deny all the allegations.
America's Justice Department charged 4 men in connection with the murder in 2021 of Jovenel Moise, then president of Haiti. The 4, 3 Haitian Americans and a Colombian, were transferred to Miami from Haiti, where the case had become bogged down amid death threats against local judges.
Peru continued to be seized by unrest. At least 58 people have died in protests that began in December against President Dina Boluarte, demanding new elections and the freeing of her predecessor, Pedro Castillo, who was jailed after ordering the closure of Congress. Scores of roads, especially in the southern highlands, remain blocked. Food, petrol and oxygen for hospitals are running short in some towns.
more emergency workers who were present at or shortly after the beating that led to the death of Tyre Nichols in Memphis were either sacked or suspended from their jobs. Mr. Nichols, who was black, was stopped by 5 policemen, all of them also black, for alleged reckless driving. In body cam video they pull Mr. Nichols from his car and repeatedly punch him. All 5 are charged with second-degree murder.
The FBI conducted a search at Joe Biden's holiday home in Delaware for sensitive material. No classified documents were found.
Volodymyr Zelensky warned that Russian forces have been stepping up their artillery bombardment in the Donbas region in the east of Ukraine. Many people fear that Russia, which has mobilized an additional 200,000 men or more, is preparing for a fresh new offensive in the coming days or weeks.
Petr Pavel solidly won the Czech Republic's presidential election. A former head of the Czech armed forces and senior NATO official, Mr. Pavel beat Andrej Babis, a billionaire former populist prime minister, by promising to stick with the West and support Ukraine's fight against Russia. Mr. Babis had been lukewarm about defending NATO allies from a potential Russian attack.
A Russian court sentenced a journalist in absentia to 8 years in prison for describing Russia's bombing of a maternity hospital in the Ukrainian city of Mariupol last March as a deliberate act. Alexander Nevzorov was convicted under laws purporting to crack down on fake news.
The EU unveiled a Green Deal industrial plan, which proposes relaxing the rules on state aid in the single market in order to boost investments in renewable energies and technology to achieve net zero emissions. The plan is a direct response to the huge subsidies doled out to green industry in America's Inflation Reduction Act, which Europeans fear will drive green investment to the US.
Unions in France held a second day of nationwide industrial action to protest against Emmanuel Macron's proposal to raise the state retirement age to 64. Schools, public transport and fuel deliveries were all hit by strikes. In Britain, teachers, train drivers, university staff and civil servants walked out in the biggest day of union action so far in a months-long wave of public sector unrest over pay.
Nadim Zahawi was sacked as chairman of Britain's Conservative Party following revelations of unpaid tax and a significant penalty from the tax authorities. In his letter dismissing Mr. Zahawi, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, said that he had promised to uphold integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level. The decision came after a swift inquiry concluded that Mr. Zahawi had broken the ministerial code.
Meta's quarterly earnings delighted investors, for a change, as it set out a plan to reduce costs in a year of efficiency, and announced a $40 billion share buyback. Revenue fell in the last 3 months of 2022, year on year, but is expected to rise in this quarter. Still, Reality Labs, the division tasked with creating the metaverse, ran up another loss, of $4.3 billion, taking its total loss for the year to $13.7 billion.
After months of sometimes troublesome negotiations, Nissan and Renault announced a restructuring of their 2-decade-old alliance, which has been under strain since the fall from grace in 2018 of Carlos Ghosn, who had run both carmakers. The main feature of the agreement is a reduction in Renault's stake in Nissan to 15% from 43%, with the remainder of Renault's shares in Nissan to be put into a French trust and the voting rights neutralized. Each company will now own a working 15% stake in the other, which tackles a key concern of Nissan that the partnership had been unequal.
ExxonMobil, Chevron and Shell reported record annual profits of $56 billion, $37 billion and $40 billion respectively. All three benefited from the higher price of energy amid the war in Ukraine, though prices have been falling in recent months.
Unilever appointed a new chief executive to replace Alan Jope, who is standing down in July. Hein Schumacher is currently the boss of the world's largest dairy cooperative, which is based in the Netherlands. He'll take the reins of the consumer goods conglomerate amid investor unease about its lagging share price, and criticism from some quarters about its purpose-driven approach to selling mayonnaise.
Salesforce, which is also under pressure from investors to improve its stock performance, appointed 3 independent directors. This came shortly after Elliott Management, an activist hedge fund, took a small stake in the software company.
The amount of money wiped off the value of Gautam Adani's companies since Hindenburg Research, an American short seller, said that their stock was artificially inflated past $108 billion. Adani Group forcefully denies the charges. More than $100 billion has been wiped from the Indian billionaire's fortune.
The Federal Reserve lifted its key interest rate by 0.25 percentage point, to a range of between 4.5% and 4.75%, the highest it has been since September 2007. It was the smallest increase since the Fed embarked on a course of tightening monetary policy last March.
Faced with higher inflation rates than America, the European Central Bank and the Bank of England each raised their main rate by 0.5 percentage point. The ECB's deposit rate is now 2.5%. The Bank of England's base rate is 4%, its highest level since 2008.
America's stock markets had a strong start to 2023. The Nasdaq Composite rose by 10.7% in January, its best start to the year since 2001. The S&P 500 was up by 6.2% and the Dow Jones Industrial Average by 2.8%. Britain's FTSE 100, a star performer amid last year's dismal market rout, also rose by 4.3%.
The IMF raised its forecast slightly of world GDP this year, which it now thinks will grow by 2.9%. The fund believes that adverse risks have moderated since its previous estimate in October, noting that global inflation is expected to fall to 6.6%, from 8.8% last year, and that China's reopening after COVID lockdowns will boost demand. Europe has also proved resilient despite the war in Ukraine and high energy prices. The IMF even reckons that Russia's economy will grow by 0.3%, a contrast to a recent report from the World Bank, which forecast that it would shrink by 3.3%.
The euro area's economy grew by 1.9% in the final quarter of 2022, year-on-year, helped by government support on energy bills and mild weather, which dampened fuel demand. The currency bloc's GDP expanded by 3.5% over the whole year. Annual consumer price inflation slowed to 8.5% in January, from 9.2% in December.
South Korea reported a trade deficit of $47.5 billion in 2022, the largest since records began in 1956. In January of this year, the deficit came in at $12.7 billion, the highest ever for a month. Exports of Korean chips and other tech have shriveled while prices for imports of fuel and commodities have surged. This week Samsung Electronics reported its worst quarterly performance in 8 years. Profit from semiconductors plunged by 97%, year-on-year.
Intel's chief executive and other senior managers are to take big pay cuts, after the chipmaker reported a surprise quarterly loss and plunging sales. It expects to make another loss this quarter.
Boeing delivered its final 747 to a customer, ending production of a plane that revolutionized air travel through non-stop transocean flights. The aircraft's inaugural commercial flight, Pan Am from New York to London in January 1970, took just 6 hours and 14 minutes, though its departure was delayed by 7 hours. That's all for this week's episode of News This Week. We hope you found it informative and engaging. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll be back next week with more of the latest and most important news from around the globe. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our website and social media pages for more updates and insights. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel News Around World for more updates and insights on the latest news from around the globe. See you next week for another episode.